On a sweltering afternoon on June 15, 2022, the usual quiet at the Harris County Sheriff's Office in Texas was shattered by a call to the emergency hotline. On the other end of the line was the voice of a man in a state of panic, his gasps mixing with the distinct clamor of a construction site. The man stammered, asking if this was the police. He pleaded for them to come to the Patriot construction site in the East Houston Industrial Park right away, exclaiming that there had been a murder. Recognizing the gravity of the report, within 15 minutes, multiple patrol cars and SWAT vehicles, sirens wailing, sped towards the specified location. The scene was a compound of temporary barracks, erected from corrugated metal and steel frames, set deep within a large construction site nearing completion. Hundreds of workers had stopped their tasks, gathering in hushed, anxious crowds, their faces still pale with shock. The police quickly established a security perimeter, ordering all unauthorized personnel to move back. Detective Sergeant Marcus Cole, head of the Homicide Division and an investigator known for his calm demeanor and sharp analytical skills, took direct command of the scene. He, along with other detectives and the forensics team, entered the barracks. The scene inside was chaotic and bloody. In the middle of the main common area, used for meals and rest, a man lay collapsed in a pool of blood. The victim was identified as Leo Vance, 40, the construction foreman in charge of the project. He had numerous stab wounds, particularly in the chest and abdomen, his clothes torn and soaked in fresh blood. But what stunned the investigators most was not the victim's body. A short distance away, slumped against a steel support beam, sat a young man. His face was vacant, his soulless eyes staring into space. His clothes were also covered in blood, and in his hand, he still clutched a large, sharp butcher knife, the weapon that had just committed the crime. He showed no intention of fleeing or resisting, sitting there as silent as a statue. Nearby, a young woman had fainted and was being tended to by other workers in a corner. Sergeant Cole asked who had called it in. A thin man, his face still ashen, stepped forward. He stated it was him and introduced himself as Frank Miller, a worker there. Sergeant Cole instructed him to tell him everything he saw. After taking a deep breath to steady himself, Frank began to recount the events, his voice trembling. He said the young man sitting there was Danny Sullivan, also a construction worker on their crew. The woman who had fainted was Hannah, Dana's wife, who was in charge of cooking for the crew. About 30 minutes earlier, Frank had been walking past the temporary restroom area when he heard strange noises. Peeking through a gap in the metal wall, he froze when he saw Hannah and the foreman, Leo Vance, engaged in an illicit affair. Scared and unsure of what to do, he rushed to find Danny to tell him. Frank said, his voice still shaking, that when he told Danny, the color drained from his face. Danny did not say a word, just walked silently into the kitchen area. Frank had a bad feeling, so he followed him. He saw him grab the butcher knife they used to cut meat. Frank tried to stop him, but it was too late. Danny was like a madman. He kicked the door to the main barracks open. Leo and Hannah were still in there. And then Danny rushed in and just started stabbing Leo, over and over. Hannah screamed and fainted. After it was done, Danny just sat down and stayed there until they all arrived. The initial witness testimony painted a clear picture of a murder driven by jealousy. The killer, victim, witness, and the direct cause all seemed to have been identified on the spot. Sergeant Cole signaled for his officers to handcuff Danny Sullivan. The young man offered no resistance, quietly putting his hands forward, his eyes still empty and void. The crime scene investigation began immediately. The forensics team started their work. The body of Leo Vance was examined thoroughly. They counted a total of 7 stab wounds, 3 of which were fatal blows to the left chest, piercing the lung and heart, causing massive blood loss and immediate death. The bloody butcher knife was collected as evidence. Every trace at the scene, from footprints and blood splatters to the position of objects, was photographed and meticulously measured. Hannah Sullivan, after receiving medical attention, remained in a state of extreme shock and was unable to give a statement. She was taken to a hospital for observation under the watch of 2 female officers. Meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, the first interrogation of Danny Sullivan began. Contrary to what the investigators expected, denial, evasion, or agitation, Danny was incredibly calm and forthcoming. Danny stated in a flat, emotionless voice that he had killed him. He added that he did not regret it and was ready to face the consequences under the law. Dana's cold confession surprised the investigators. The case seemed simpler than they thought. a crime of passion, a killer who confessed on the spot, with ample evidence and witnesses. It would likely be closed quickly. However, as investigators began to delve into the personal histories of Danny Sullivan and his wife, Hannah, they started to realize that behind this seemingly straightforward act of jealous rage lay a long, tragic story of love, betrayal, and the limits of forgiveness. Danny Sullivan's background check showed he was a man of good character with no prior criminal record. His fellow workers all shared the same opinion. Danny was a kind, simple, and hard-working man who deeply loved his wife and child. He rarely drank or gambled, and his routine was to work and then return to the barracks with his wife. How could such a man act with such brutality? What rage could turn a gentle man into a cold-blooded killer? Sergeant Cole sensed this was not just a momentary snap. There had to have been a long period of suppression, a series of tragedies smoldering beneath the surface for a long time. Today was just the final drop that made the cup overflow. The murder case seemed clear from the start, but Sergeant Cole knew the hardest part was not finding the killer, but uncovering the tragedy that led a good man to this breaking point. To understand the crime, they first had to understand the man. And to understand Danny Sullivan, they had to start with his love story. At the Harris County Sheriff's Office, the atmosphere was tense. After the initial crime scene processing was complete, Danny Sullivan was brought into an interrogation room. Unlike hardened criminals, Danny showed no signs of resistance or evasion. He sat silently on the steel chair, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the cold tile floor, as if he had completely accepted his fate. Across from him sat Sergeant Cole. He did not start with a barrage of questions but simply placed a cup of warm water on the table. Sergeant Cole said in a steady voice for him to drink it and calm down, then asked if he knew who he had stabbed. Danny replied in a hoarse voice that he knew, identifying the man as Leo Vance, his foreman. The sergeant then asked why he did it. The question seemed to touch a raw, bleeding wound in the young man's soul. Danny was silent for a long moment, his shoulders trembling. He looked up, his eyes meeting the sergeant's. There was no hatred in his gaze, only an immense and bottomless pain and despair. Danny said, his voice like a long sigh, that it all started from the beginning. He reflected that if it were not for that fateful meeting, his life probably would not have ended up like this. And so, in the cold interrogation room, Danny Sullivan began to tell the story of his life. A story that began 3 years ago. The curtain on the tragedy was beginning to rise. The story began on an evening in late 2019 in Dallas, Texas. At the time, Danny was 25, a simple, kind-hearted young man from rural Oklahoma, working on a construction crew for Leo Vance's company. That night, to celebrate the completion of a project, Leo generously booked a VIP room at the Velvet Room, one of the city's most well-known nightlife spots, to treat his entire crew. Danny, unaccustomed to such loud, lavish places, felt out of place amidst the large room, flashing colored lights, and the strong smell of liquor. While the other workers and contractors were clinking glasses and shouting, Danny retreated to a corner, quietly sipping a soda. He felt this world was not for him. Just then, the door swung open. A group of hostesses in short, tight dresses walked in, quickly mingling with the party. Some poured beers, others sat on the laps of men old enough to be their fathers, letting out flirtatious, inviting laughs. Danny glanced at them once and looked away, but something caught his attention. Among the girls, there was one who was different from the rest. Her name was Hannah. Hannah was not the most beautiful, but she had a special, fragile kind of charm. She was a bit thin, and the smile on her lips seemed like a forced mask to hide the exhaustion and weariness evident in her eyes. Those eyes, as Danny recalled, were incredibly sad, a sadness as deep as an autumn lake. While other men were teasing and groping the girls, Danny just quietly observed Hannah. He saw how she skillfully deflected lewd invitations, how she discreetly pushed away a hand that tried to touch her. Danny did not feel contempt for her instead. He felt a strange sense of compassion. He wondered what had pushed a girl who seemed so gentle into this line of work. The party grew louder. After a few drinks, Leo Vance and his contractor friends started picking songs. They sang loud dance tracks and cheesy love ballads. Then it was Dana's turn. Pressured by the others, he had no choice but to go up. He did not choose a trendy song but an old country classic about a mother. When the music started, Dana's simple, sincere, and slightly trembling voice caused the noisy room to quiet down a bit. He sang with all the emotion of a son far from home, thinking of his hard-working mother. And in that moment, his eyes and Hannah's met. It was no longer a polite glance, no longer a distance between a construction worker and a hostess. He saw in her eyes a shared understanding, an unspoken emotion. She, in turn, seemed to see the sincerity and kindness in him, something so rare and precious in a place like this. An invisible but powerful bond had formed between two lonely souls. After that night, before leaving, Danny gathered all his courage to ask for Hannah's phone number. To his surprise, she agreed. In the following days, they began texting. At first, it was just casual messages, asking about work and life. But the conversations grew longer, deeper. Danny told Hannah about his family in Oklahoma, about his dream of building a house for his parents. And Hannah, for the first time, opened her heart to a man. She told him about her struggling family, about having to drop out of school to move to the city to earn a living, and about the traps that had led her down this path. Their first date did not take place in a fancy restaurant or a romantic coffee shop. Danny could only afford to take her to a taco truck on the corner. In the cool Dallas air, over a plate of hot tacos, they had a memorable evening. Danny's simplicity and sincerity deeply moved Hannah. Hannah asked timidly if he was not afraid of what people would say about him being with someone like her. Danny did not answer right away. He just quietly placed the best piece of steak from his plate onto hers. He replied that he did not care what people said, he only knew that when he talked to her, he saw a good person. By the end of the date, Hannah, with unexpected courage, decided to lay it all bare. She said she had to be honest with him, confessing that she worked as a hostess and asking if he looked down on her, tears streaming down her face. Danny was silent for a long moment, then he reached out and took her trembling hand in his. He told her firmly that he was not rich, just a construction worker, and could not give her a mansion or a fancy car. But he could give her a family, a decent home, and an honest life. He offered that if she wanted it, she should leave that job and come with him. That sentence, that handshake, completely broke down Hannah's last defenses. For the first time in her life, a man did not see her as a commodity, did not lust after her body, but wanted to give her a future, a family. She nodded, through her tears. In the cold interrogation room, the story of the tragedy had only just begun. Sergeant Cole sat in silence, listening without interruption. He knew that to understand the fatal knife thrust of today, he had to patiently turn back every page of a complicated past, a past that began with sincerity but was born from the darkest of places. Sergeant Cole remained silent, patiently listening to Danny Sullivan's story. The guilty man's memories continued to flow, taking everyone back to Dallas in late 2019, where a love born of sincerity also sowed the seeds of a future tragedy. After Danny's firm handshake and promise that night, Hannah made a life-altering decision. She resolved to leave her job at the Velvet Room. It was not easy. She faced pressure, even threats, from the club owner who did not want to lose a popular hostess. But Danny was always by her side, his simple protection giving her strength. Finally, Hannah left that world behind to start a new, honest life with a man she believed would be her safe harbor. They moved in together into a small, cramped rental apartment, no more than 150 square feet, in Danny's hometown in Oklahoma. The new life, though materially lacking, was filled with happiness at first. Danny worked at construction sites during the day and came home to Hannah at night. Hannah shed the revealing dresses and thick makeup to become a normal woman. She learned to go to the market, cook family meals, and take care of Danny. That simple peace was a luxury she had never known. She felt loved, respected as a real person. But that peace did not last long. As the novelty of love wore off, the hardships of daily life became apparent. Hannah, accustomed to a life of glamour and easy money, began to feel suffocated. The longing for expensive clothes, fancy outings, and the feeling of having plenty of cash in her pocket began to smolder again. She started comparing Danny to the wealthy men she had met and then looked at the harsh reality of their rundown apartment. Minor conflicts began to arise. But just then, Hannah discovered she was pregnant. The news was like a summer rain, temporarily extinguishing the flames of discontent. Their love was rekindled by the hope of a complete family. Danny was overjoyed. He worked harder, saving every dollar for his wife and child. A small, simple wedding was held in their hometown, blessed by family and friends. A few months later, they welcomed their first son, Liam, with boundless joy. But that joy was also the beginning of new pressures. A child brought endless expenses: diapers, formula, medicine, which became a huge burden. Dana's construction salary, even with exhausting overtime, was only about $2,800 a month and quickly became insufficient for a family of 3. Hannah began to change from a gentle wife into an irritable, critical woman. Family dinners were no longer warm, replaced by her complaints and reproaches. Where was the money for the baby's formula? Where was the rent money? Look at how other men provide for their families, and then look at you. Those words were like knives stabbing at Dana's self-esteem. He felt helpless, like a useless husband and father. He loved his wife and child, but he did not know how to escape the cycle of poverty. And so, he made a decision. He heard about a major project in Louisiana where the work was harder, but the pay could be double, even triple. He decided to work far from home, endure a few years to save some capital, and then return to open a small business for his wife, giving his family a better life. When Danny told Hannah, she hesitated but eventually agreed. Deep down, she felt both pity for her husband having to work so far away and a slight sense of relief at not having to face him every day, not having to hear his helpless apologies. The day Danny left, Hannah cried a lot. They hugged, making promises. He promised to send money regularly and call every day. She promised to stay home, raise their son, and wait for his return. But neither of them could have imagined that this separation would be the beginning of an irreparable breakdown. Danny threw himself into his work at the remote construction site. He worked day and night, scrimping and saving every penny to send home. But back in Oklahoma, Hannah faced different challenges. Raising a child alone, the loneliness of the cold apartment, and the scornful looks and gossip of neighbors who knew her past and did not believe she could change. The gossip was like needles pricking at her already fragile self-esteem. Then, the final straw came. Their son, Liam, suddenly developed a high fever and had to be rushed to the hospital. He was diagnosed with severe pneumonia, requiring a long and costly treatment. The money Danny sent home was not enough to cover the medical bills. In a moment of desperation, Hannah did something she had sworn never to do again. A young man in the neighborhood, aware of her situation and having made advances before, approached her with an indecent proposal. He would lend her the money for the hospital bills on the condition that she repay him with one night. Hannah cried and refused. But seeing her son struggling to breathe in the hospital bed, facing a growing pile of bills, her last moral boundary collapsed. She sold herself one more time. And once the first time happens, the next times follow. After her son was discharged, Hannah continued the secret relationship, and then others. She returned to her old ways, living a double life. By day, a caring mother; by night, she would secretly put on makeup and visit cheap motels to earn extra income. But that secret could not be hidden forever. And the person who discovered it, ironically, was Mark Sullivan, Dana's own brother. One weekend afternoon, Mark was waiting for someone and checked into a nearby motel to rest. As he walked up the stairs, he froze. The woman who had just stepped out of a room, hastily pulling her collar up, her face flushed with embarrassment, was none other than Hannah, his sister-in-law. When Hannah saw him, her face went white, and she quickly looked down and tried to hurry away. Mark was too shocked to speak, simply watching as she scurried out of the motel like a thief. He did not cause a scene, but as a brother, he could not let Danny continue to be deceived. That night, Mark made a long phone call to Louisiana. On the other end, Danny was cheerfully talking about his work, asking about his wife and son. After some hesitation, Mark told him the whole truth. At the construction site in Louisiana, inside the noisy barracks, Danny Sullivan stood frozen. The phone slipped from his hand. A ringing filled his ears. He could not hear anything else. His entire world, his faith, his love, it all seemed to completely shatter in that moment. Danny Sullivan's painful memories continued to pour out in the interrogation room. His story was no longer a simple criminal confession, but a tragedy of love and betrayal that drew even the seasoned investigators into a heavy silence. After the fateful phone call from his brother, Danny could not function. The world he had painstakingly built, the trust he had placed in his wife, had all been destroyed. Rage and the pain of betrayal erupted like a fire, consuming him. That very night, he lied to his foreman, saying there was a family emergency, and boarded a bus straight from Louisiana to Oklahoma, a journey of nearly 300 miles. Throughout the long ride, Danny did not sleep a wink. His mind was filled with images of Hannah, her smile, her promises, and the disgusting image his brother had described. He thought about beating her, cursing her, ending the marriage immediately. But then, the image of his little boy, Liam, returned. His innocent smile, the way he called out Dada, became a lifeline that kept him from completely succumbing to his rage. What should he do? The conflict between love, hatred, and the responsibility of a father tormented him all night. When Danny arrived home at dawn the next day, Hannah was stunned to see him. She knew her secret was out. Without waiting for him to say a word, she fell to her knees at his feet, hugging his dust-covered legs and sobbing. She cried out in desperation that she was sorry, so sorry. She admitted it was her fault and that she had no right to face him. But she pleaded for him to believe her, insisting she only did it for their son. Hannah wept as she told him the story of their son's illness, the lack of money, and how she was pushed to the brink. She blamed her circumstances, her own weakness. She begged Danny to forgive her, just this once, for their son, for their small family. Danny stood there, frozen like a statue. His anger seemed to have subsided, replaced by a numbing pain. He looked down at the wife kneeling at his feet, then into the bedroom where his son was sleeping peacefully. He had a choice: end his broken family, leaving his child without a home, or forgive, swallowing his pain to hold onto a fractured marriage. And with a blind love and a foolishly large capacity for forgiveness, Danny chose the latter. He slowly bent down and helped Hannah up. He told her in a hoarse voice to get up. He would forgive her this time, but there would not be a second time. He forgave her, but he knew they could not continue living in Oklahoma. The stain of her actions would never wash away. He could not face his brother, his family, or the gossip of the neighbors. He decided they had to leave, go somewhere completely new to start over. Their young son, Liam, would temporarily stay with his grandparents. It was an agonizing decision, but Danny believed it was the only way to save his marriage. A few days later, the couple quietly packed their bags, leaving behind their hometown, their family, and their child, and headed for the industrial park in East Houston, Texas, hoping for a new beginning. Dana's story paused there. Sergeant Cole and the other investigators in the room were silent. The tragedy Danny had recounted, though heartbreaking, was still just his side of the story. To ensure objectivity, every detail had to be verified. Immediately, Sergeant Cole dispatched a team of 3 experienced detectives to Oklahoma. Their mission was to confirm the entire story Danny had told. 2 days later, the team was in Dana's hometown. They first met with Mark Sullivan, Dana's brother. At first, Mark was hesitant, but when he learned this was part of a murder investigation in which his brother was the killer, he held nothing back. Sitting in his modest home, Mark, with a weary face, confirmed the entire story. He recounted the fateful afternoon he saw his sister-in-law at the motel, his shock and disbelief. Mark said, his voice full of bitterness, that he was so angry. But she was his sister-in-law, and he could not make a scene. He just knew he had to call Danny and tell him the truth so he could handle his own family problems. He advised him to leave her, but Danny was too soft-hearted and loved his son too much, so he forgave her. Mark never thought his forgiveness would lead to what happened today. Mark's testimony perfectly matched what Danny had said. Next, the detectives visited Dana's parents, where Liam was staying. The elderly couple was devastated by the news of their son's crime. They also confirmed the story of Dana's sudden return from Louisiana, the tense days that followed, and the painful decision for the couple to leave their child behind to find work elsewhere. Dana's father said through tears that he was the kindest, most hard-working one in the family and had never gotten into a fight or talked back to anyone his whole life. He blamed it all on his wife, claiming she ruined his son's life and was a curse. Every detail of Dana's story was confirmed. The team in Oklahoma sent a detailed report back to the main investigation. Back in the interrogation room in Houston, after receiving the confirmation report, Sergeant Cole looked at Danny Sullivan with a different perspective. In his eyes, Danny was not just a cold-blooded killer but also a pitiful victim of a love tragedy. But the law is the law, and a crime is a crime. Sergeant Cole stated that his story about what happened in Oklahoma had been verified and was all true. Danny just nodded, saying nothing. Sergeant Cole then instructed him to continue and tell them what happened after they arrived in Houston. In the interrogation room, Sergeant Cole and his team continued to listen to Danny Sullivan's fragmented memories. The story of his life after his painful decision to forgive his wife had entered a new chapter, one written with the faint hope of a fresh start. According to Danny, their life at the East Houston Industrial Park showed positive signs at first. They were housed in the workers' barracks, which, though temporary, offered them their own space. Danny threw himself into his work, clinging to the scaffolding from dawn till dusk, trying to use physical exhaustion to forget his emotional wounds. And Hannah, to atone for her mistakes, also appeared to be very diligent. She took on the job of cooking for the entire crew, a task that required hard work and dedication. They spoke less than before. The warmth of their love was gone, replaced by a strained connection born of obligation. But Danny still had hope. He believed that time and their mutual effort would eventually heal all wounds. But Danny was wrong. He had not anticipated the cruel irony of fate. More importantly, he had overestimated a person's capacity to change. The foreman they were working for was none other than Leo Vance, the same man who had been at the Velvet Room in Dallas 3 years ago. Of course, Leo did not remember a lowly construction worker like Danny, but he was immediately drawn to Hannah's mature beauty, tinged with a hint of sadness. Leo Vance was a slick, predatory man, accustomed to using money and power to get what he wanted. Seeing Hannah working hard in the kitchen, Leo found ways to approach her. He gave her an easier job, a clerical position logging worker hours, a clean desk job with a significantly higher salary. When Danny heard his wife had been favored by the foreman, he was initially happy, thinking their lives were finally improving. He had no idea it was a trap, a calculated investment by the lecherous foreman to get closer to his wife. In the following days, Leo frequently used work as an excuse to call Hannah into his private office. He started with compliments and small gifts, then moved on to generous cash bonuses. Hannah, a woman with a complicated past and a soul hardened to material temptations, did not take long to fall. The suffocation of poverty, the strain in her relationship with Danny after the incident in Oklahoma, and the aura of power and wealth that Leo exuded at all pushed her down the path of transgression once more. She deluded herself into thinking she was only doing it for a better life, to be able to bring her son to live with them sooner. And so, she betrayed Danny again, right on the very ground where he toiled and sweated every day. The illicit relationship might have gone undiscovered if not for the chance encounter by another worker, Frank Miller, the man who called the police. One afternoon, he heard strange noises coming from the foreman's private bathroom, which was located right next to the common facilities. Peeking through a crack in the metal wall, he was stunned to recognize the two people inside as the foreman and Hannah, the wife of his crewmate. Frank was torn, but in the end, his loyalty to his friend won. He could not let his friend be cheated on right under his nose. He found Danny and told him everything. Danny's voice trembled in the interrogation room, his eyes shot with blood-red veins. He recounted that when Frank told him, his ears were ringing. He could not believe it. He had forgiven her once. He had thrown everything away to start over with her. And yet, she continued to trample on his trust. The limit of Danny's forgiveness had been broken. The jealousy, rage, and resentment that had been suppressed for so long, combined with the humiliation of being cuckolded by his own boss, exploded into an uncontrollable fury. Danny continued, his voice almost a growl, that he could not think anymore. There was only one thought in his head. He had to kill them both. He walked straight to the kitchen where he saw the butcher knife they used to cut meat, and he grabbed it. Frank tried to stop him, but he could not hold him back then. He was like an animal. He kicked down the door to Leo's barracks. Danny paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes squeezed shut as if reliving the horrific moment. He described that before his eyes, they were tangled together, his wife and Leo. The madness inside him erupted. He rushed in, raised the knife, and stabbed. He did not remember how many times he stabbed. He just knew he kept stabbing until Leo collapsed, until the rage inside him cooled. When he stopped, Hannah had fainted next to him. And as for him, he just sat there and waited for the police to come. The full, detailed confession was over. The entire tragedy had been laid bare. Sergeant Cole looked at the young man, whose head was now bowed on the table, a complex mix of feelings welling inside him. He was at once a cold-blooded killer and a pitiful victim of betrayal. After corroborating the full testimonies from Danny Sullivan, the witness Frank Miller, and Hannah Sullivan once she had recovered, the investigative team decided to conduct a crime scene reconstruction. A few days later, on a quiet morning, Danny Sullivan was brought back to the construction site. The scene had been preserved. Under the close supervision of investigators and the prosecutor's office, Danny had to reenact his entire crime. He pointed to the spot where he heard the news from Frank. He walked into the kitchen, picking up a prop knife. Then he walked to the victim's barracks, reenacted kicking down the door, and finally, swung the prop knife towards a mannequin placed where Leo Vance had fallen. Each of Dana's actions was performed mechanically, soullessly, like a man whose emotions had died. His face showed no remorse, no anger, only a terrifying emptiness. The reconstruction went smoothly, with every detail matching his confession and the evidence from the scene. The investigation phase of the case could now be officially closed. With a full confession, witnesses, and evidence, the Harris County Sheriff's Office quickly finalized their investigation. The entire case file was transferred to the District Attorney's Office, recommending the indictment of Daniel Sullivan for the crime of murder. The tragedy that began in a Dallas club, passed through a betrayal in Oklahoma, and ended in blood in Houston was now heading towards its final chapter in a court of law. Hannah Sullivan, after providing her full testimony as a person of interest and key witness, was released. But for her, freedom was now more bitter than any prison. Her husband was facing a long prison sentence. Her lover was dead. She herself had become a social pariah and unfaithful wife, an indirect cause of a horrific crime. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she left Houston in shame. No one knew where she went. Her future was a dark, endless void. In Oklahoma, the news about Danny finally reached his family. They were devastated. Dana's elderly father fell ill, and his mother could only cry until she had no tears left. Their greatest pain was not just losing their gentle son to the legal system, but the worry for the future of their young grandson, Liam, a child who would have to grow up without the care of either parent, carrying the story of a family so broken it could never be mended. The case also sparked a heated public debate. When the full story of Dana's life, his sacrifices, his forgiveness, and the betrayals he endured was published by the media, many people expressed sympathy for the killer. They did not condone the act of murder, but they felt sorrow for a good man pushed to the breaking point. People debated the limits of forgiveness, the pressures of poverty, and the complexities of human nature. In the eyes of a segment of society, Danny Sullivan transformed from a murderer into a tragic victim of circumstance. The case file was studied meticulously by the prosecutors. The charge of murder against Danny Sullivan was undeniable. However, upon reviewing all the circumstances, a significant mitigating factor was introduced. Dana's crime did not stem from a thuggish or violent nature, but was an impulsive act in a fit of rage immediately after witnessing an unbearable truth. He had been severely provoked and his honor deeply insulted by his wife and the victim. This is a critical factor in the legal code, known as committing a crime in a state of extreme emotional disturbance or a crime of passion. Furthermore, after committing the crime, Danny did not flee. He sat at the scene and waited to be arrested. Throughout the investigation, he was completely honest, showing clear remorse for his actions. His good character and lack of a prior criminal record were also taken into account. A severe sentence was unavoidable for the crime he committed. But with these clear mitigating factors, the outcome for Danny Sullivan would not be the highest possible sentence. For the crime of murder committed in a state of extreme emotional disturbance, coupled with his sincere confession, a fixed-term prison sentence was the inevitable outcome awaiting him at trial. He would have to pay for a moment of uncontrolled rage with long years in prison. But perhaps that was still a form of mercy from the law for a man who had endured so much tragedy. The case would finally close. But the story of the gentle construction worker, Danny Sullivan, would remain a haunting reminder of the limits of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a noble virtue, but it has its own boundaries. When forgiveness is exploited, when kindness is repeatedly trampled upon, it can turn the gentlest of men into a savage beast. This tragedy is also a bitter lesson about choices and human nature. Hannah had a chance to start her life over, but she chose to return to her old path, dragging everyone into a spiral of tragedy. And Danny, he chose to trust and forgive blindly, only to receive a bitter end. The vicious cycle of habit and wrong decisions pushed them all into a life with no escape, leaving behind only blood, tears, and a nagging question: in love, how far can one forgive?